Hey, and welcome to the second episode in the Jonah series. It's officially the third video, but this takes on chapter 2 of Jonah. And so you have the first video, which is the introduction, the second video, which Pete takes us through chapter 1. And today we're going through chapter 2. And so Steve will really be guiding the conversation and the teaching for us, and we'll be gleaning from the wisdom of Peter Breen Sr. And I'll be trying to ask some questions that really eke out some application from this word. So I'm joined by Steve.
Hi, Reese.
And Peter.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here again.
Absolutely. And so just as a highlight kind of thing from the last week then, where we left off was the quite major incident in reality where a man is thrown overboard and swallowed by a fish. Quite a large statement, that bit, like, I feel like we don't really give it the kind of madness that is due, that a guy gets swallowed by a fish after be thrown over a boat. But this is the first thing really that you want to get stuck into, Steve, is the question of the fish.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's interesting. You think about being thrown into the water. I don't know if you had this thought of, well, couldn't he have swum? Maybe he could have just sort of swam through it and it would have been okay. And Dad and I obviously used to do a lot of swimming together on holiday when I was much younger. And I remember we used to swim out to this buoy that was maybe half a mile offshore, something like that. And it just seemed like an absolute age to get there. And so you might think, well, do you know what, we might just be able to swim through it. But you've got to imagine the waves, massive waves. You've got to imagine it's a long way from shore. You've got to imagine that every time you open your mouth, you're gulping water. I mean, there is no chance that this guy is going to be able to swim it, even if he was an Olympic swimmer. And he's not, because the Hebrews, the Israelites, were not swimmers. They were not interested in it. They were not good fishermen. They were scared of the sea. They're Phoenicians who are just north of them. They kind of like the sea, but the Israelites really didn't like it. They thought it was the place of the evil. They thought it was the place where all bad things happened. So there was no chance for this guy to swim it. I mean, that wasn't going to happen. And then verse 17 of chapter 1 is really interesting. It says, now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. The Lord provided a fish. That's extraordinary. And I think sometimes we get the impression that, God knew that Jonah was going to drown and so on. But the fish was a punishment. It was kind of a way of punishing Jonah, that he gets eaten by a fish. I mean, how terrible is this to get eaten by a fish? In fact, the fish was the salvation. The fish was the rescue. It's his own fishy submarine that turns up and rescues him from going down in the water and dying in the sea. Otherwise, this guy is going to die in the sea. Now, it might be a bit sort of out of the frying pan into the fire, but nevertheless, it's better to be alive in a fish than dead in the sea.
So this idea of provision, not punishment, like, how do we see this in life? I think my question from like week 1 into week 2 is that how do we know when we're walking away that clearly? Like, we don't always get the wording from God to go somewhere that clearly. And so, like, how do you know when you're about to get thrown off a boat in the middle of a storm because you've walked away? And then when a fish comes along and swallows you up, how do you know that's provision and not punishment?
Yeah, because provision is not always, doesn't always feel nice in that sense, does it? I've had circumstances in my life where things have happened to me and actually they've been really, really difficult. And Jonah's going to explore that in this chapter, where there's been things that have been really tough, but they've been there actually to mold me and grow me and help me to develop in faith. I think when it comes to that whole question of, is it provision, is it punishment? I think it is about that walking step by step with God, isn't it? And whereas Jonah had this really clear word, I think there are times, when as we start to step forward with God, we'll get nudges and hints of, I'm not sure that's right for you. I'm not sure that's the way. But my stubborn heart, certainly, the whole alpha male type says, well, I'm going to have a go anyway. And the whole Moses character, he goes out and says, right, this is the time. Now we're going to start bringing the Israelites out and so on. And God says, it's not time. And that's one of the things that I find it difficult, but I'm trying to learn it bit by bit, is that God is going to speak to me. He's going to nudge me. He's going to give me insights into when it's not the right time. and that will be for my good. That will be for my blessing.
For sure. So the matter of provision and punishment is really about perspective, I guess. The 3 Ps.
Love it.
And so is that perspective found in his prayer that we're about to go through?
Yeah, it is very much so. And this prayer is really interesting in that it is a poem. It's a poem which is obviously written in Hebrew. And Hebrew poetry, thankfully for us, doesn't rhyme. Because, of course, if you were going to write poetry in English, it would mostly rhyme and you could break the rules a little bit. But by and large, we know how poems work. They work together in sets of 2 lines and the second line rhymes and so on. Hebrew poetry, thankfully for us, doesn't work that way because, of course, we don't read Hebrew, so we wouldn't catch all of the rhyming. But the way it works is in sets of 2 lines, which are described as parallelism. And those 2 lines will either say the same thing or say an opposite thing, or they'll kind of expand on the same thing. So just the first bit there, he said, in my distress, I called to the Lord and he answered me. That's the first bit. And the second part, from the depth of the realm of the dead, I called for help and you listened to my cry. So in my distress, from the deep in the realm of the dead, those 2 bits go together. I called to the Lord, I called for help. Those bits go together. And he answered me and you listened to my cry. Those bits go together. So you can see that Jonah's not trying to say 2 different things. He's trying to say exactly the same thing twice because that's how Hebrew poetry works. And you might say, well, why does he use a poem? You know, because he could have said this in sort of prose, in a statement, etc. But poetry is a way to be able to express heart and emotion. It's a way to be able to say a little bit about who we are. If you want to say something really beautiful to your beloved, one way to do it's in a song. What is a song? It's a poem to words, isn't it? And it's a poem to music. And so Jonah is pouring out his heart in this prayer towards God.
That's great. I guess one of the benefits of, he's kind of in lockdown, isn't he? And like everyone likes to think in lockdown they'll be creative. It didn't quite work out that way for a lot of people. But I guess one of the benefits of it not just being a quick prayer, he's had 3 days to write a poem here, hasn't he? So this is the result of 3 days in lockdown.
Yeah, he's had some thinking time, hasn't he? I mean, I was always fascinated by the fish, actually. And I don't know, Dad, whether you've got some thoughts around this. Was it a real fish? Was it a whale? I mean, I can kind of see, you know, if this is a whale and maybe it breathes air, then maybe Jonah can survive in there. Is it a fish? Is it a whale? Is it just a metaphor? What's your feeling about it?
For me personally, it was a real fish. Whether it was a fish or a whale, I'm not sure that Hebrew is specific enough to distinguish between fish and air-breathing mammals. I mean, it'd be common in the Bible, wouldn't it? This idea that animals might be used by the Lord because they're wiser than humans. There's a verse that you know very well, Steve, must have come in your Isaiah series. The ox knows his master, the donkey his owner's manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand.
Yeah.
Exemplified in Balaam and his donkey. Man, who was the fool there? Who was the real ass? You know who it was. I mean, it could be a metaphor, but for me, the only reason for making it a metaphor, as far as I can see from the passage, would be because we're a bit uncomfortable with a particular fish managing to swallow Jonah. But to be honest, if that's where my theology is, I'm a bit uncomfortable with Jesus taking 5 loaves of bread to feed 5,000 as well. I've shouted at storms on a couple of occasions. They've never been still for me. So, and the way Jonah speaks about it in chapter 2, from the inside of the fish, he prayed. The fish vomited Jonah. To me, I think it's got to be a huge fish.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I'm inclined to feel it's that way. My own perspective is it probably is a whale rather than a fish, because again, I'm not sure Hebrews have the difference between that. You know, it's all in the water and swimming. So my feeling is it probably is a whale, and there's an air sac going on there that Jonah gets to breathe in. Horrible, nevertheless. I mean, who wants to be inside a fish and trying to survive? But nevertheless, I see it as a real thing, and I see it as God's provision in a way that wasn't comfortable, but in a way that changed Jonah in a really dramatic way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it'd be funny if, like, obviously, I mean, it's not funny. Like, they thought he was going to be dead, didn't they? Like, when they chucked him overboard, they didn't think he was going to survive that. Can you imagine, like, the next reaction of seeing him in a whale's mouth? You're like, guys, what do we do? There's no. I mean, to be fair, they're not. They're just kind of transport, aren't they? They're not really fishermen. I'm gonna say harpoon that thing, get him back. But I'd be like, oh no, that's gone worse than I thought. He's literally been eaten in the sea. That's a nightmare.
Yeah, God would be really upset with him. He's on that whole lot.
Like, it was worse than we thought, guys. In regards to in my distress, I called the Lord, and He answered me. From the deep realm of the dead, I called for help, and He listened to my cry. I think, man, that's surely something we all resonate with in our distress, calling out to the Lord. And I think there's surely encouragement in the fact that He answered the cry of Jonah. I just wonder if you want to open out about what those moments look like for you in your distress, calling out for the Lord. I guess maybe there's a difference. I mean, you can answer this. Maybe there's a difference in when you're not necessarily walking away from the pattern of what God's put in front of you, and still stuff is kind of disaster struck. Obviously, this is very specifically about the fact that He's walked away from God's plan in this regards. Maybe there is a difference. Maybe there isn't. Of when we call out in distress, when there's a very real distress, and when we call out in distress when we're the ones at fault. I just wonder if you could open up about that.
I just love the fact that when He calls out, God hears. You know, that's amazing, isn't it? And we sort of have this idea, well, if I call, then God's got to listen, but He doesn't. He's God. God doesn't have to do anything. The very fact that God pays any regard to Jonah at all is amazing, and the very fact that God pays regard to me when I call to Him is absolutely amazing. I never want to lose the wonder and the amazement of that. The God of heaven hears my cry. That's incredible. And I love the fact it came out of distress. And Jonah calls out and says, help, nothing else can work here. It's a real help prayer, isn't it? How much can he formulate as he's going down in the water? It's just this absolute help prayer. But it does make me think that, you know, maybe I need the moment of distress in order to remember God's there, and how much more wonderful it would be if I could just keep God at the forefront of my mind, even when I wasn't in distress. Imagine if I did it when it was good. If Jonah would only listen to God when he was on the land, he wouldn't have had to call out for him when he was in the sea, you know?
Yeah. If he called out for God on the way down to Joppa or on the way down into the boat, and called out to God and say, is this okay if I go this direction, God? He wouldn't have had the distress to call out to Him. The contrast between chapter 1 and chapter 2 is huge, isn't it? He doesn't say a word. It's other people who call on God. The pagan seaman. Chapter 2. I remember Sandra's dad telling me he was a D-Day vet, and he went in on a tank landing craft. And I said to him, what did you think as you were going in? He said, I prayed. We all did. Because in your distress, even if you're not a normal praying person, you pray. And God hears. Whoa.
It's amazing, isn't it? And that expression where he talks about going down to the depths of the grave. I know, Dad, you've done some work around this. It'd be great if you could share your thoughts around it.
Yeah. I mean, the grave translates a Hebrew word that many people will have heard of called Sheol. And it usually means just simply the place where people go when they die. Not always bad either. Frequently, perhaps on balance, 80% of the references to it in the Old Testament are words like the wicked go down to the realm of the dead and all the nations that forget God. That's Psalm 9:17. But also, let me read you Psalm 49:15. But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to Himself. So within it, it was the place where people went when they died. So very clearly, for me, Jonah thought he was about to expire and go to the realm of the dead. That's where he thought he would go. You get the clearest picture of it really in Luke 16. But that's probably beyond our remit today. But the rich man and Lazarus, were both in that place called the realm of the dead. And it just seems to me that Jonah believed that's where he was.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. From that moment, then, from the depths of trouble and from, I guess, from being in that place in Sheol, obviously, verse 4, so chapter 2, verse 4 says, I've been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple.
Yeah.
Now, that's quite a different perspective from the one of I've been thrown into Sheol.
Yeah.
And one quite like marvelous perspective, I guess, and one quite glorious in understanding that, yeah, yet again, I will look towards your holy temple. I just wonder if you can unpack that.
Yeah, and it's a great expression, isn't it? So far, as we've mentioned a few times, Jonah has gone down, down, down. And this is the first moment he goes, yeah, I will look up, as high up as you can go, to the holy temple of God, to Mount Zion, not just the physical Mount Zion, which is where the temple was built, but the spiritual Mount Zion, in other words, heaven itself, where God lives. I've been banished, he says, I've gone as far down as I can go. This is as bad as it can be, yet I will look up. The grace in that verse is astonishing, isn't it? And the comfort it gives me, no matter how far down I go, no matter how far away from him I fall, there is grace, there is mercy, there is forgiveness, there is recovery of this whole position. God will accept me if I come in repentance and I come in faith towards him and look towards his dwelling place. I can't get more excited than that and be more amazed than that wonderful grace that he pours out.
Yeah.
Just wonder if you want to add anything, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, the expression "holy temple" is used twice, isn't it? It's used again in verse 6, verse 7. The holy temple. The temple was the place that Solomon put up under instructions of David and God to be the real centerpiece, the heartbeat of God's people. And as Steve said, that to me is amazing. Just to think that he, from the depths of hell almost, looks up and says, I'm going to go to the place where God lives, where God dwells. I think there must have been almost an epiphany at that moment between those two verses as he was going down. And he suddenly sees God. I always think of God's glory when I think of the temple.
Right.
And he almost sees that, it seems to me. Perhaps that's what lit up wherever he was in the whale. I don't know. Maybe there was that at that very moment. But it's a lovely expression, isn't it? It doesn't just say, I'm going to get out of this. I'm looking towards your holy temple, the place where you live, God. I'm coming to live with you again.
I wonder then if you can talk into, I think this is something I've heard, maybe I've struggled with in the past with certain things. And I mean, if people listen to the Die Hanky conversation, then it'll be in that as well. The process of walking away from God, people clothe themselves then in the guilt and shame of that, the guilt and shame of that kind of act and the acts of sinful desire and sinful nature and physically walking away. His response directly after, I was thrown into the belly of Sheol, but I trust that I'll see you in your holy temple, and going straight from the pits to eyes up. That's quite a sharp difference very quickly. I think maybe a lot of us would choose to wallow in the fact that like we messed up, like we went away. Okay, God, well, that's me done. Like that's me gone. That's my story written. Like this is the story I've written for myself, and I'm gonna stay here, God. There's no way you can do anything else with me. Do me a favor, just kind of chew me up and spit me on the side of the beach, and I'll just be done with it. I'll just sit in a cave until I die because I messed up. But that's not what we see, and that's not what we're gonna see either. And so you've got wisdom for dealing with sin in the right way, in coming before God, and then having that guilt and shame properly removed, understanding that God forgives and restores. Just wonder if you've got like examples of that, or just can you unpack the beauty of forgiveness in that regards, to then be restored rightly and to walk in what God is then doing?
Yeah, Jonah sees just salvation, doesn't he? That's the thing, and that's what colours it completely. He's realised how bad it can be. In verses 5 to 7, he describes in it's a really graphic detail what he was going through. The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me, seaweed was wrapped around my head, and that's like really, really graphic ideas. Like there's kind of all wrapped around with seaweed. I almost see it like a Disney movie, you know, and he's like, going down and down and can't get out. To the roots of the mountains I sank, but you, Lord, brought my life up out of the pit. He is so overwhelmed by the salvation that he can't feel the guilt and the shame.
Yeah.
That's the key to it. And I really understand and I feel for anyone who's in that position where they're going through that guilt and that shame. And I think Martin Luther had exactly this experience where he wrestled with God and just felt so deeply ashamed of everything that he was, and he said, "Oh, what a wretched sinner I am." And it was when grace and that reality of salvation broke through that he was able to come past that. Jonah catches it really quickly. He's actually quite amazing like that because it touches his heart really, really quickly. But it's the salvation that wipes out the guilt and his knowledge of salvation. This is amazing, Lord God. You saved me. I never deserved this. I never deserved to be rescued in this situation, yet you have rescued me. So as a result, what am I going to do other than say, that's amazing. And I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to let that be the defining moment and the defining pattern of my life. People who grab that salvation, I think, are those who are and own it for themselves, are able then to move forward in that spirit of humility, because it's not about triumphalism, not in the slightest, but of love for God. And of knowledge of who they are in him because he saved me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering with this, whether, see, we got 3 days to play with. And chapter 2 might have been written over not written, spoken over 3 days. I mean, you know, looking like this, perhaps verses 2 and 3 were written on day 1. He's been hurled into the water. He's in the, I mean, you imagine the unspeakable sliminess inside that and motion and I don't even know where he was, but whatever was going on, stuff washing in and out and over him, and he must have felt he was dying on several occasions. Maybe that was verse 1, but day 1. By the time he gets to day 2, he's thinking, hang on, I'm still here.
Yeah.
Is that when he says, I think what Steve says is really important, that it's not always easy for us to grasp from the guilt of where we've come, of the awfulness of our sinfulness. It's not always easy to grasp God in all of that. But this is what he says: you brought up my life from the pit.
Amen.
And then he says again, when my life was ebbing away. So he gave life in my death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great place to be, isn't it? To know this, that actually it isn't even about my guilt. It's not even about my repentance. Though they're important, it's him who gives me the life to come out of death.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, I mean, from that then, segue into from fear to faith in that regards, the whole message so far. We want to wrap that up in verses 8 and 9, and so I just kind of want to unleash you to go with that, Steve.
Yeah, it changes the whole perspective, doesn't it? His experience changes his perspective, and you know, Jonah discovered what many of us discovered: God just would not let him go.
Yeah,
and he tried to run, but the Lord pursued him and grabbed him and dragged him in and said, "Come on, you are my guy, you are my man, you are my child. I want you for myself." And when that happens, it just pours out of you then in praise. I think there's nothing more pure than that. But the moment you grasp it, you get it. It's like, yeah. And the moment when you get it again, you know, these moments come for us again and again, don't they? Just want to encourage everyone who's listening to get back into God's presence. If there are things that you need to confess before him, things you need to bring before him, things which you feel personally disappointed about, get into his presence once again, because when you do, you'll discover that God will not let you go. Through the storm and through the problems, God does not let you go. And he comes on to say, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love, but with shouts of grateful praise, I will sacrifice to you. And he's basically saying, I've realized that I made a mistake here, but I also realize that there's grace, that there's mercy, that there's forgiveness, and there's a second chance. And I'm so excited about that second chance. And he talks about the fact of worthless idols. Of course, the sailors have been trying to pray out to their gods and nothing happens. And then Jonah says, well, actually, I worship the God of heaven and earth. And they're petrified. What, you worship the great God over everything? Yes, he said, the great God who turns everything around. Mm. And then they're petrified because those are worthless idols compared with the great God. And some of the idols that we worship, some of the things we try to believe in, our own ability, or maybe our finances, maybe the money I'm bringing in, my job, maybe the security of all of that, maybe just my own personality or false personality, all this kind of stuff I might want to believe in, or my fame, or hey, none of us here are famous, but you know what I mean? Maybe sometimes we believe our own hype. All those things we try and believe in are actually idols. And they're fundamentally worthless. And the only one who's worth anything is our God, who comes through for us every time. What he says is this: salvation comes from the Lord.
Yeah. I love that he finishes up with praise like that.
Yeah.
We were commenting at the beginning, Steve and I, before we actually got into this broadcast, that most of the expressions that you find in that prayer, you can find in the Psalms. Mm-hmm. The Jonah's songbook. Now, you know what you do when your heart's going away from the Lord and you suddenly rediscover him. You start singing. You have to. You keep rehearsing things. I remember songs that I sung when I was really young, though I don't remember the stories I wrote. But I remember songs from primary school. And one of the great things about poetry is it sticks in your mind. And I think what he did was to rehearse the goodness of God over and over again. And I want to encourage anybody who's drifting away, get in God's presence and sing his praises at the top of your voice. I know it's lockdown and we can't do it in church, but do it in your home, do it in your car, do it wherever you can, because that brings hearts back to the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah, we've never had such opportunity, have we? As you think about our generation, and we've got Spotify, for goodness sake. There's no Christian song you can't get. So get into God's presence in that way. Why would we not?
Yeah.
Also then, in regards to your notes, which I have in front of me, there's a really beautiful bit I just want to read out. And so you said he does so in the knowledge that. So he promises to God. We don't know exactly what he promised, but it seems highly likely that he promised to go to Nineveh to preach. Though he does so in the knowledge that salvation comes from the Lord. When God calls us to serve him, we do so in the context of our salvation. Jonah is not out to please God or to try to win his favor, but to do what God wants out of thanksgiving for what God has done for him. And just as we come up to end, I think it's probably funny that when left to his own devices, he obviously got on a boat and went miles away. And I think it's cool that God didn't just send a boat with people saying, right, now you've got to come back. And he sent a fish who he had no control over the direction of that fish. I'm like, man, he was making sure Jonah was gonna get to the right place. He was like, there is no way out of this fish unless I open its mouth. There is no way you control this fish. I am in control because I've seen you go wayward before. So he had 3 days of learning his lesson and he's out of there. I think 3 days in a fish or a whale is probably more than enough. I'd say an hour in a whale for me. That maybe 5 minutes in a whale is enough to me be like, okay, guys, you can get me out now.
Yeah.
But, I wonder if we just want to highlight the last verse then, verse 10. And the Lord spoke to the fish and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Any wisdom?
Well, I reckon he must have been a changed man, physically, visibly. I mean, I don't know where he was in the fish, but if he was anywhere near the digestive system, his hair would have gone white, his skin would have gone yellowed. He probably was very wrinkled. I think emotionally he was probably changed too. I think he would be. So he was definitely a changed man, that's for sure. And one of the great things about God is he takes us into circumstances because he wants to change us. And I've no doubt he was changed for the better. By the time we get to chapter 4, we won't spoil the story, but by the time he gets to chapter 4, he's not totally changed. There's still more changing to do. But here's one of those times in his life, and he's vomited onto dry land. He got a free ride. He had to pay the fare out, but he got a free ride back. God put him exactly where he wanted him, on the beach.
I love it. I love that comment you made then about how there was more changing to do as well. That gives me encouragement because, of course, it was a big moment. I mean, this was dramatic, wasn't it? And, of course, Jonah learned a whole lot. But that wasn't everything that he was going to learn. And there were more lessons to come. And that is my experience. That's, I think, the experience of every Christian is that, okay, there's always more to learn. There's always more where I need to pick up something from God. There will not just be one difficult circumstance in life. There will be many. And each of those are opportunities for me to either be bitter or to be better. And God gives me that opportunity to be better through those circumstances. I love that thought and that expression. And I love the fact as well, the Lord commanded the fish. There's God speaking all the way through, isn't he? He's speaking through. Now he's speaking to a fish. There's all this time when God provides and God provides and God provides. And then he's speaking and he's speaking and he's speaking. And I want to hear God's voice again. We've talked so much about how getting into the Bible is about hearing God. It's fundamentally not just about reading a book. It's about hearing God. It's about getting something from him, from his heart, from the reality of who he is, and being able to apply that to our everyday life. This is genuinely applicable to my life tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if there's like one final thing from God where the last laugh is his, where he sends him out of the blowhole rather than the mouth. And he's like the ejector seat of the whale just goes skyrocketing into the air. That'll wake him up when he's back on dry land. Yeah, amazing. Thank you very much. I think that last kind of comment about, you know, the opportunity is there to be either better or better, and walk then with the Lord, which will go directly into our next session, which is all about Jonah going to Nineveh. And the great changing of the people from Nineveh's heart. And so thank you very much for joining us. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening in on Spotify, it's great to be joined by you again. You can subscribe to all of our content either on any streaming device for